This video is sponsored by Squarespace. It's been rainy and cool for the past few days, so I've been looking out at my yard and having very, very bad thoughts because I have been thinking, would it be possible to have a flower farm in a residential yard? My yard is a decent size. My lot is a little bit bigger, but I've been looking out there and I think it would be very possible to have a $20,000 backyard flower farm. And so I am gonna share this farm plan with you. Now, I'm not saying I'm gonna do this. For the last 6 years, I had a flower farm, which I really, really enjoyed. You know, I gained a huge amount of experience, got so much growing knowledge, but I also am really appreciating this year not being stuck in the farm cycle. It can be very overwhelming to have to be, forming your life completely around a farm, and that's kind of the reality of all farming. I will also say, I do kind of miss the routine of it all. I'm finding it hard to keep on top of, planting dates and everything because I don't have those farm milestones that I need to hit. So, I am missing the farm a little bit. But as I look out at my yard, I'm really surprised to see just how little it would take in order to be able to get this kind of mini farm to success. $20,000 seems like a pretty big number for a business, but in terms of what it would mean for the flower farm, when I break it down, it would be a 25-week growing season. I know it would be a 25-week growing season because I've grown for 6 years. I know how long my growing season is, and so that's only 1,000 bouquets across 25 weeks, which is 40 bouquets a week. For the last handful of years, I was kind of prepping 120 bouquets for the weekend. I was often making, another 20 or 30 bouquets midweek. The space that I was managing, was about an acre of growing space, so what's that, like 20,000 square feet? So like I'm used to things on a lot larger scale. When I think about what would it take to sell 40 bouquets, everything for me with, the larger growing experience that I have feels really manageable. I know that, I had been struggled and challenged at my local farmer's market because I'd only been able to sell 40 bouquets a week. And, with the old flower farm, the goal was to do $100,000 a year, which meant I needed 200 bouquets a week. So the idea of, I could go to the farmer's market and I could sell 40 bouquets and that would be what I need to achieve, as opposed to, these numbers aren't quite what I need to reach success. It starts to make the whole system seem really practical. I'm growing in the Okanagan, so my season kind of begins early May, some years maybe late April with tulips, and then it extends and we go to Canadian Thanksgiving, which is like mid-October. So I have a lot of experience with those dates. I know that some years it expands past the 25 weeks, but I also know that it isn't very often that it's going to shrink more than that. And the reality is 6 years of farming experience has my harvesting, my planting, my all my farming skills have a lot of speed and efficiency to them. I also have experience with what grows really well in my area. I have experience with what sells well for my local customers. Over 6 years, I, defined my bouquet recipes. Every year I was always, making them more towards what the customers were looking for. I was always watching, does this sell, does it not, always tweaking the recipes. So, I do have a lot of experience that I could bring to this farm idea. My biggest concern of all with the farm plan is space. Because I'm in a residential yard instead of, a big farm space, I really don't have a lot of square footage to grow in. And so the idea of making 1,000 bouquets could be a little intimidating. Right here, I'm in what's, my main garden spot. It's one of the only flat, full sun areas in my yard. And this space is very large, you know, for a backyard, but it's still only 1,200 square feet. And back on the farm, that would only be 6 beds, and I was used to having 100 to grow in. I also have this hill space here, which is slanted, so it's going to be a little limited for what I can grow in here. And this is about 1,000 square feet too. You know, so with all of my backyard, there's about 2,200 square feet. But I also have this front yard space, and even though it doesn't look like much, there is a lot that can be grown in here. This year I'm experimenting with anemones and ranunculus because this is kind of sun in the morning and shade in the afternoon. And I think it's gonna make it so that they can thrive a lot more than they ever did back on my farm that was pure sun. I'm also in the process of removing this evergreen hedge, and this is gonna give me an additional 750 square feet. Even though that's pretty good for a backyard, it really isn't a lot of growing space when we're talking about starting an entire farm. And the only reason why I think that this $20,000 plan is still possible is because I'm bringing 2 essential lessons that I learned in my 6 years of farming, and that is the importance of high value flowers and succession planting. When I first started with growing flowers for sale, I focused on growing the easiest and simplest flowers of all because I really didn't have a lot of flower growing experience. I needed those really simple crops. And because of that, the bouquets needed a lot of flowers in order to look valuable. As the years have gone on, I've learned that different flowers have different, you know, sales prices that you can get for them. And I've leaned in more and more to making sure that I have a high value focal in all of my bouquets. So on the farm, my farm planning wasn't about what I could grow. On the farm, my farm planning was about what bouquets was I gonna make at what specific time of the year, and that was about what was gonna be the focal. I always started with the focus being on what is the most valuable focal in this specific time frame, and then, you know, I added on the little bits and pieces that I needed to make a complete bouquet. But as much as possible, I wanted those bouquets to have, you know, not a lot of stems, but a lot of value. As years went on, you know, the bouquets, they didn't necessarily get any smaller, but I realized that there was lots of things that I could grow that in a single cut could, you know, really add a lot to a bouquet. Perfect example is Lisianthus. You know, in my first years, the bouquets were, you know, fistfuls of zinnias, you know, but as I learned with my growing and my farming, and I grew those more challenging crops like the Lisianthus, a single stem of Lisianthus can get put into a bouquet and do more than all those zinnias ever could. The other thing is that with flowers, you know, they're such a long season crop. They aren't as easy to succession plant as veggies are. So many veggies, like lettuce, is really, really simple. You seed to a head of lettuce is 60 days. You can plan your farm knowing that every 2 months you're gonna be flipping out that crop to sell. If you have 6 months of growing season, that means you get 3 rotations in that single bed. You know, the math and the succession planning is very simple. With flowers, it can be a little bit more challenging. The flower planning kind of begins an entire year ahead of time. Right now, the tulips have just finished up in my yard, and this would be the time that I would need to be ordering tulips in order to get them to show up in the fall, to plant them, to have them for the spring to sell. So it's almost an entire year that, you know, you need to be planning for these things. And a lot of veggie crops, you know, were kind of like 60 to 75 days, whereas the flowers can kind of be 120 days from planting out a seedling to getting a bloom. And that means that with, you know, my 25-week season here in the Okanagan, here in Zone 5, I don't necessarily have the ability to as easily succession plan. But I also have the experience to know that what I can and can't do. So, you know, great example is tulips. You plant them out in the fall, they come out really, really early. Any space that you use for tulips is going to be very, very simple to replace with almost every single crop on your farm. And another example is sunflowers. Sunflowers are kind of like the lettuce heads of flower farming. They're 60 days, seed to bloom. And so with the sunflowers, because you can get such a long season of them, you can replant into that space. So you only need kind of like an 8-week window for the succession, right? If I have a 25-week window for sales, I probably can grow sunflowers for 20 weeks of those, right? So that means that, you know, in the space that I grow sunflowers, I'd grow sunflowers twice. Another really important lesson that I've taken away from, you know, having the large scale farm is how important it is to not have any gaps in your sales. And to do that, you need to have a really good balance of different product available at different times a year. It's honestly one of the things that I loved the most about flower farming. With the veggie farming, it was kind of spring, summer crops, but with flower farming, it was kind of every week looked different. And, you know, one of the most incredible things about buying local flowers from local farms is that the flowers that you get that week are, you know, they encapsulate a moment in time. You know, the following week, those bouquets aren't going to look identical. You go into a grocery store right now and, you know, you see roses and lilies and baby's breath, and, you know, they're kind of the same no matter what time of the year you go. But, you know, those local flowers, they really showcase the way that you move through the season. But to be able to do that for your customers, you need to know what you're doing on your farm, and you need to know what can be showcased at different times of the season. I have a lot of pictures of a lot of different bouquets from over the years, because it was always so much fun to capture what the bouquets looked like from week to week. And because of that, I basically have, you know, a farm plan built in to those pictures. So I went through and I kind of identified what are all the focals for me to achieve that, you know, entire season of flowers. I also included the square footage that I'd need to grow those, because I'm familiar with growing all these plants. And I was really surprised at how possible this kind of farm plan based on my previous bouquets would be. So for the early season in May, what I would have is tulips. And the amazing thing about tulips is that you can pull them into cold storage and they can get stored in there for 4 to 6 weeks. So it kind of doesn't really matter when the tulips bloom. You're guaranteed to be able to get kind of 4 to 6 weeks out of them, even if they all bloom kind of in the same week, because they're stored in the cooler and you can pull them out as you need them. So, you know, to do 40 bouquets a week, you know, if we said that, you know, I'm going to need 10 tulips, because they don't always make it, in order to get an 8 tulip bouquet, which was my $20 bouquets previously, you know, and you want to do that for 4 weeks, that's, you know, 1,600 tulips. That feels like baby numbers for me, because I was used to doing, you know, kind of 8,000. I think one year we did 12,000 tulips. I probably would grow more than that. I probably would aim for doing about 3,000 tulips, and that would take about 200 square feet. Then as the tulips kind of fade out, there's about a 2-week window when ranunculus and anemones are the main thing available to be sold. And I figure to do bouquets that have mainly ranunculus with some anemones to kind of complement them, I would want 300 ranunculus plants. Ranunculus do kind of about a bloom a week for their production season, and my production season is usually pretty short because our heat comes and kind of kills them off. And then I'd want about 600 anemones. Their season can be a little bit earlier. They would come in when I still have tulips, and fingers crossed they'd maybe continue after too. So I'd put about 600 anemones in. And you know, like, they take a little bit of money to invest into, but that amount is kind of like, I'm saying 400 square feet. I could probably get those to fit into even less space. And I'm really excited to see how well they do in kind of part shade instead of the full sun, which was the only thing I had available at the farm. They might be something that could be really successful for me. After that, peonies were the focal, and I would be nervous about sourcing peonies other than the fact that I already have 60 peonies planted here. And the peonies that I planted are specifically cut flower varieties. I even have another 15, I think, that I haven't planted that are just, in pots that I could add into the yard. They're not going to produce any flowers for me this year. Next year, they'll probably only kind of produce 1, maybe 2 per plant. But peonies very easily do 5 stems a year that you could pick every single year, which is 300 stems. And with 300 stems, I very easily could have peonies as a focal in a bouquet, kind of having 2 peonies in each bouquet for a bunch of weeks. And I could maybe even do peony bunches. And that's not even going to take up square footage in my garden because it's kind of planted into this area that I'm not even counting as growing area. After peonies, the lilies come in. They're not very popular in my area, but they save my butt every year with the flower farm. They kind of came in at a period of time when there was no other focal. And the nice thing about the lilies too is I did them as a perennial system because I only used them when they bloomed because they weren't very popular for the customers for the rest of the time. So I would probably have 200 peonies. I'm saying that'd be about 100 square feet. And by having the Orientals and the Asiatics bloom about 2 weeks before the Orientals. That would give me a really good 2, 3, maybe even 4 week window of a focal when, I might not have anything else. Around that same time, we're kind of mid-June here for this, sunflowers. Sunflower blooms are starting to be available. And I'm saying if I aimed for 50 sunflowers a week for every single week, that would only take 200 square feet. I couldn't do purely sunflower bouquets and be able to sell 40 of them. That's just more than what there's demand in my area. But at the old farm, I always did kind of like 10, 15, 20 sunflower bouquets in my, 120 numbers, and they all always sold really well. Well, I always needed some of them. So having 50 sunflower blooms a week, I could, kind of turn those into, because I usually sell sunflowers for $2.50. So if I did kind of like 8 sunflower bunches, that right there would be 5 bouquets without anything else added into it. And I could definitely turn those 50 blooms into 25 sunflower focaled bouquets. Then as we head into July, cosmos, July, August, September, cosmos are kind of a backup flower in every single bouquet, and that would need about 200 square feet for, enough to keep me going through the whole season. Lisianthus starts blooming. In this farm plan, I have 1,200 Lisianthus planted because that's a single case. That's the least amount that you can buy from Ball. And I said here that it would take 300 square feet, but honestly, when I look at these numbers, I could probably fit the 1,200 in only 200 square feet because you can plant those so densely. And the Lisianthus were so valuable. The Lisianthus kind of made a bouquet on their own. A bouquet recipe that was doing really well and was so simple for me to make was I was doing 4 stems of Lisianthus and then a couple stems of Status kind of mixed in, and that was just the bouquet. And like, I was selling kind of like 20 of those a week when I was making them. So I know like with 1,200 Lisianthus, even if I grew it really poorly and I only got a single stem, 1,200 Lisianthus, if I was doing 40 4-stem bouquets of it every week, that's gonna be 8 weeks of just pure Lisianthus to cover my 40 bouquets a week. I love Status. I wouldn't want to be without it. And so, I figure 120 Status plants would give me the ability to put 3 stems in every single one of those 40 bouquets. Status produces about a stem a week. And, you know, that's only gonna take 100 square feet. It really doesn't need a lot of space. And then marigolds, you know, my bouquets have been so dependent on those for August, September into October, but each plant produces a lot of stems. Even if a bouquet I was using 2 stems, I figure I probably get about 6 cuts off of every single marigold plant. And so I was saying if I had 60 marigolds in 200 square feet, that should do me for the entire season. Zinnias, love zinnias. I'm saying 160 of them. Zinnias produce about 1 stem a week for cuts, so 160 plants would give me 4 zinnias in every single one of those bouquets, and that's only going to take 100 square feet. Zinnias are also an amazing option for filling in space as you succession plant because they go from seed to bloom quite fast. And then, because I want to do, you know, some higher value stuff, like I said, that's kind of the trick to getting these bouquets with not much space. If I had 50 dahlias, that would take about 150 square feet, and dahlias also produce about 1 stem a week for kind of August, September for me, and they're very valuable stems. So yet again, right? Like, and with these numbers, these are conservative numbers, right? This is me kind of enough zinnias to grow, you know, 40 bouquets worth of focals, but I'm also having all these other things that are going to be available at the same time. So in total, the square footage for all of those focals is only 1,950 square feet. And as I looked at that number, I realized probably about 600 square feet of that is stuff that could be succession planted. So, you know, I kind of only need 1,400 square feet for my focals, and it's pretty easy to kind of tack on a few supplementary flowers and some greenery or filler in, you know, another kind of 500 square feet of space. You know, I really feel confident that, you know, with 2,000, 2,500 square feet of my yard, I'd be able to have all the flowers that I need and then some, and it would even leave me space to have my vegetable garden still. So, you know, the space thing isn't so much of a concern. Okay, but it's raining like crazy, so I'm getting soaked. We need to move to a new spot. Hiding inside from the rain. It's easy to get excited about how many flowers I could grow, right? I mean, I think that's what draws so many people to, you know, the dream of flower farming. But, you know, the one thing that I really learned from having a farm for those 6 years is it doesn't matter how many flowers you grow, it doesn't matter how, you know, exciting it all is, you need to be looking at it as a business. And so I can, you know, look out at my garden space and count up the square feet that I have and dream about how many blooms I could cut out of it. But you know, it's good to ask yourself, how much is this gonna cost to do? Because maybe it costs so much that it's not worth doing. Back on my old farm, I invested probably like $250,000 into building the farm to what it was. You know, that money adds up really quickly, and I don't have that kind of money to invest again. But when I started to think about like what I would actually need, I think I'd only need about $10,000 worth of investment to get to the point that, you know, I could run this farm. The biggest investment of all would be a walk-in cooler. I would not have a flower farm without a walk-in cooler. In the beginning, I didn't have one in the first few years, and it's a transformative piece of equipment, and especially so for the flowers. It made a little bit more sense when I had the veggies. A lot of stuff, you know, you could hydro cool it. So, you know, lettuce, you pick it, you dunk it in cold water. It takes the field heat off, and then it makes it so that it stores and lasts for a really long time. Can't really do that with flowers. And the difference between a properly conditioned flower versus a flower straight out of the field is huge. I didn't really realize how much of a difference it makes because, you know, I've had the cooler for so many years, but a few of the spring bouquets that I've made for myself this year already has really shown me, you know, how much it changes things. You know, flowers that have been picked and cooled and conditioned in that walk-in cooler, it almost doubles their vase life. It's incredible. And having had the cooler for so many years, you know, I have a lot of confidence with using it. There's a lot of stuff that I used to be like, oh, you know, I have to pick this and sell it right away. I can only hold on to these flowers for a day or two. But now with the experience that I have, I know the right stage to pick the flowers at for them to be in the cooler. There's a lot of things, you know, out of that list that I had, you know, that can be in the cooler for 2 weeks without it really affecting vase life at all. You know, some of those things like the tulips and the peonies, they can get stored in there for a month or two. Having that equipment really makes it so that, you know, that season without the gaps, you know, the workflow, the efficiencies, not having to, you know, kind of figure out a way to, you know, pick something on a Tuesday and then sell it on Wednesday, knowing that you can kind of batch your work, do all of your picking throughout the week, and, you know, make those bouquets once a week. It's really incredible what that walk-in cooler can do. To have a walk-in cooler similar to what I had at the old farm, it would cost about $4,000. The walk-in cooler was a trailer. I'd probably build a shed here and, you know, would cost $1 million. So, you know, I figured it'd be about $2,500 to build like a fully heavily insulated, nicely finished shed space. Then I priced it. Cool bots are about $500 now. And then a window air conditioner big enough to cool the space would be $1,000. So $4,000 should get me like a good sized walk-in cooler, more space than I would ever kind of outgrow because, you know, the my growing space is so limited. In order to be able to sell things, you need to, you know, have plans for how you're going to sell it. One of the best things that we had, hands down, best thing we ever did on the old farm was having a roadside stand. I mean, the farm location was incredible. It was such a good high traffic area that the roadside stand kind of just marketed itself. People drove by and stopped, you know, it was just a really, really great location. Here, not so much, but still, you know, you don't need to be delivering things. You know, customers will come to you, especially when the numbers I'm talking about are 40 bouquets. So it's not that many customers. But to be able to do that, I need to make it easy and convenient for them. So what I would do is in my carport space, I would have a fridge. And, you know, I'd have like a sign up, something just very simple. People could come, open the fridge, grab their bouquets. But a fridge and some basic signage would be about $1,000. And then I'd want to do markets. So the plan would be to do Saturday markets. At the old farm, one of the reasons why we had such strong sales in the spring is at the Kelowna Farmers Market, there wasn't a lot of farmers who wanted to invest into spring stock. Things like tulips, anemones, ranunculus, all that stuff, it's expensive. You need to be buying those tulip bulbs every year, and they're not cheap. I went and priced them, and I figured to get, you know, a tulip into a bouquet costs about 80 cents per flower. So, you know, it's good money considering how low the labor is and how much volume you can do when you're selling them for $2, $2.50, but it is a risk, and you do need to have cash flow to kind of make it happen. So, you know, down at the Kelowna Farmers Market, coming with tulips kind of, you know, made it so there wasn't a lot of competition. Come summer, you know, every single farm had flowers and it was harder to compete. But, you know, I could really do well, I think, still going to the Kelowna Farmers Market for a spring season. And then close to me is a smaller local community market. Doesn't have huge numbers. It was the first market that I did at the old farm to kind of break into, you know, our first original sales. But it would be a great place to go to let, you know, local people know that I have flowers and they're available. And the Friday nights is when the market is, and it pairs with like a music in the park night. So the summer season of that market actually does quite well. So I could do Kelowna Farmer Market in the spring and then Lake Country Farmer Market in the summer, and, you know, potentially go back to the Kelowna Farmers Market in the fall. But it actually costs a lot of money to have a market set up. And so I need about $1,000 for the market setup. And every time I talk about this, people think I'm crazy, but you know, I priced it, I did a breakdown. So to get a market tent is $300. They do have cheaper ones, but they're gonna fall apart after a couple markets. It's worth getting the good quality one. The metal buckets that I used as display buckets, those were really expensive. We had like $1,000 or more worth of inventory at the old farm of those metal buckets. But doing 40 bouquets, I would need to have 10 buckets because, you know, at the biggest size, they were four bouquets per bucket. So 10 of those metal buckets, $300. I'd need a table. I don't I don't own any folding tables. So it'd be about $100 to get a good quality folding table. And then I'd need to spend about $100 to get signage, get a banner, you know, get some like, you know, bouquets cost this much money type small things printed out. That's $6,000 of my $10,000 budget. And I don't, you know, I don't have a breakdown on everything, but, you know, all those little nickel dime things really add up to being a lot of money you need to invest into a farm. So seed starting. I have you know, a light rack available. I got one from the old farm to grow my own plants, but that's not enough. That's not going to be enough to do an entire farm. It can hold 20 trays, and growing in a smaller sized either soil block or plug, you know, I have the seed starting skills to be able to do things in 200 trays. The light rack holds 20 trays. So 200 trays means I could get 4,000 plants, I think. You know, which is a lot, but you know, like the volume needs to be a little bit bigger than that. I would need a bit more space than that. If I was buying Lisianthus and then potting it up before planting it out, since I won't have greenhouses to grow in here, you know, a case of 5 trays of Lisianthus potted into 72s turns into 20 trays of Lisianthus. So that right there would fill the entire light rack. You know, I'd want to be pre-starting anemones and ranunculus. So, you know, I'd need to be investing into a little bit more equipment for that. Even things like the seed starting trays, bottom trays, I needed some this year. You know, I had a small collection that I took from the old farm to be able to grow my own seedlings. But yeah, picking them up, they were like $2.50 each. The 72 inserts were $2. You know, and when you need kind of like 100 of them, you know, that the money starts to really add up. I'd need also some raised beds or crates for doing some of the growing. The tulips, you know, the easiest way to kind of grow them is in raised beds with some compost. You know, it's something that I could be reusing from year to year, but, you know, I would have to do that initial investment. I'd need merchandising supplies. You know, part of that is, you know, in the annual budget, but there's a lot of things that are kind of like one-time purchases, like getting a stapler, you know, they're getting a Kerchunk machine. What are those? A stem cutter. All those little things that I'd kind of bought over the years at the old farm are things that I'm going to need to purchase again for myself. I'm lucky to have a really nice shed in the backyard that you know would be a good space to be able to kind of work on the arranging and everything. I could still have a space that isn't inside my house to do a lot of the flower arranging. But yeah, it's gonna take some money to be able to get it set up. Irrigation. At the old farm, there was so much money spent on irrigation. It was crazy. But here, you know, even if it's just figuring out an irrigation system to do, you know, 3,000 square feet, that's still, you know, still going to be some money. Hoses are like $100 now. I was like, I need a hose, and I was like, what? Everything's so expensive. Yeah, so who knows? Who knows how much that would cost? And then there's, you know, stuff that's kind of one-time purchases that I'd want again, like perennials. You know, I have a bunch of shade here. I've already spent $200 on hellebores, but if I could like justify that I'm gonna sell like flowers from them, I could spend like more money on hellebores. But no, like there is stuff that, you know, kind of you plant at the beginning of a farm and you come back to it year after year. You know, some of this stuff is things I've already invested in, like the peonies, you know, but that, you know, even if you're getting a few of these plants, it all kind of adds up. So I really feel like the $10,000 budget to start this farm is probably a pretty accurate number. The rain stopped. It's actually kind of nice out now. Spending $10,000 to make $20,000 every single year, you know, is a no-brainer. But, you know, the one thing to remember is that there is also going to be annual expenses, right? Like if I'm gonna do $20,000 in sales, if I'm gonna sell 1,000 bouquets, it's gonna cost me money. I figure that there's about $5,000 of annual expenses that it would cost me in order to, you know, do this year after year. To buy the tulips and the ranunculus and the anemones is actually a pretty big investment. In the past, I hadn't really had a lot of success in saving the anemones and the ranunculus. The old farm had a lot of issues with Astor's yellow disease, which also got into the ranunculus and made it so they weren't necessarily good to save from year to year. I could save some money here by trying to save some of them, but I assume I probably could only kind of save about half of, you know, the anemones and the ranunculus. So I'd have to kind of top them up every single year. And then with the tulips, yeah, I could just pick tulips like out of the yard, but for the amount of space that it would take to do that, for the quality of the bloom, it's just not worth it. And so, you know, I would be spending that money every single year to be able to, you know, pull the tulips and ditch the tulip bulbs. You know, it is an annual expense that I'd be willing to take on. For seeds and plants, I'm saying $5,000. You know, that is a pretty big number, but you know, some things are more costly than others. There's going to be some years when, you know, I'm buying bigger orders, and then some years when I'm not. And you know, there's also probably going to be, you know, perennials getting added in that budget, experimenting with different things. You know, if I was going to buying glads, you know, I'd probably need a few of those bought in every year too. So even though that feels maybe like a little bit of a high number, it probably is pretty accurate. I bought a case of Lisianthus this year because I'm crazy for Lisianthus. And the cost of it to get 5 trays, which is how much the trays hold, and they're 280 trays, so you know, what is it, $1,400? The cost of it was $700. I'm doing an experiment with it this year where I've potted up some of them, and I'm going to try to sell them to try to offset my expense of buying them myself. The nice thing about doing that also is that, you know, if I buy more and then sell them, I can get more range of colors. You know, I have to kind of buy 280 of the same color. If I sell off half of it, then I can have twice as many colors. But so at $700, you know, it could make me a lot of money, but also there's a chance that, you know, I could spend $1,400 and then maybe sell $1,400 worth of Lisianthus plants. And so the plants that I actually keep for myself and plant out, you know, would kind of not have a cost associated with them to bring down, you know, the price, because stuff like that isn't included in my $20,000 of sales. Something that, you know, I never really talked about at the old farm is that the farmer's market costs money every single time you go. So the Kelowna Farmer's Market, the daily fee is $50. So if I was going to do 25 weeks of markets at $50, that's $1,250. You know, so it's expensive to buy the market setup, but it's also, you know, it makes sense when you go and you sell $800, you know, to pay that $50 fee. But every single week that $50 fee does add up to a big enough number that, you know, it is a substantial amount of the money being put out every single year. To sell the things, gotta make them look pretty. I'd probably spend about $250 a year on the paper to wrap them, elastics, staples, all those kind of, marketing supplies. The paper that I'd been using at the farm was 18 by 18 craft squares, like what is it, 30-pound craft weight. And those at Uline, I looked it up, they're $121, but that doesn't include tax and that doesn't include shipping. Uline has very expensive shipping. So, I could probably use only one of those a year, but the money adds up. And then I'd add in about $500 to the budget for what I'm gonna call miscellaneous and wear and tear. I'm saying that, in that $10,000 startup cost, I'm buying seedling trays and things and lights and things like that. Those are things that, will last me for years and years, but they will eventually wear out. So every single year as things continue, I'm going to need to be, reinvesting into the farm. There's going to be, things break, shovels break, tools get lost, all that kind of stuff. So, there always is kind of continuous expenses on those smaller items. With this plan, 25 weeks, kind of $800 a week. Even when you take out those expenses, it's not bad. Kind of bringing in like $600 of profit from week to week. The labor of this kind of plan would probably only be about 20 hours a week. It wouldn't take a lot to maintain the garden. The space would be so small that the maintenance on it would be really efficient, and everything would be planted so tight and so purposely that, it wouldn't be the same workflow that I've been used to with the larger scale farm. The other element to it is because the space is the biggest limiting factor, it'd probably be pretty simple to sell every single stem I could grow on the farm. The goal with my old farm was to build up the volume to be able to try to eventually move towards, bigger sales arenas. Getting to the point that we could be producing 1,000 stems of something a week of a really high quality flower meant that we could eventually move into doing wholesale, which was kind of the plan with that larger farm. It was more about high volume, low cost stems than it was about kind of making high profit on every single flower. But with the smaller scale, I feel like the workflow would be a lot more simpler, the selling would be a lot more simpler, and there'd be a lot less waste. The other element that I'm kind of really excited about this farm plan as I crunch through a bunch of these numbers is I think that these are conservative numbers, which those are the numbers I always like to work with. But I do think that this kind of farm plan, sales plan, crop plan does have the potential to do more than $20,000. $20,000 was kind of like, 40 bouquets is a very, very manageable number for me to consider. Having done weekends, for years where, I was going out and building 120 bouquets at a time, the idea of only doing 40 feels so simple. And a lot of those numbers that when I broke down the specific crops and how many of them I would grow, a lot of those had kind of overlap. It's like, oh, I could have 10 sunflower bouquets a week, but then I also have the potential to have 40 Lysianthus bouquets a week. And then also there's zinnia bouquets in that same week. I think that, there's a good chance that even with that tiny amount of growing space, I could, when the years are, good, there's probably potential to be able to get 60 bouquets a week out of that space. And that's going to significantly increase that crop plan. The other element where there's a lot more money kind of being left on the table is with the tulips. The tulips are about being able to invest and, staying on top of the labor more so than they're about how much I can sell. On the old farm, tulips are the Mother's Day crop. And so, I've been used to doing kind of 8,000 tulip stems. I think the maximum we ever had was 12,000. And the most of the years, you know, the tulips I was doing, the harvesting of the tulips I was doing fairly independently. And you need to be very on top of it. You need to be out looking at the tulips multiple times a day. There is no going away during tulip season. But yeah, no, like the idea of having 5,000 tulips or 6,000 tulips on my own is something that's like a really manageable idea for me. And, you know, I kind of have infinite space for tulips because they're out before any of the other crops get planted. So, you know, having had Mother's Days in the past where it's kind of like $5,000, $6,000, I think the biggest Mother's Day I ever did was an $8,000 Mother's Day. And obviously that wasn't me doing it independently. But the idea of doing a $5,000 Mother's Day on my own, which is just making 250 simple tulip bunches, that's something that I think is really manageable. And I also know that I could recruit, you know, family or friends to help me out on that Mother's Day weekend to kind of, you know, get a little bit of a higher number. You know, so I really do feel like there's, you know, that farm plan was still 40 bouquets. That was still only $800 on Mother's Day weekend. And, you know, I really feel like there's more I could do. The other thing that I could add in to bump up this the money is I have a wreath maker, and you know, this is kind of numbers based on stuff that I'm growing myself. This isn't buying in things. This isn't going foraging. I could do an entire kind of Christmas season that's dependent on going and foraging evergreens and building stuff around that. You know, so even though the 25-week season is quite a long season, there is more weeks that can be tacked on to the back end of that, doing a few other projects too. I would never plan for it to be more than $20,000. But I do think that doing a plan like this, there probably is the chance that I could have years that I could get the number up to 30,000, you know, without kind of substantially adding to those annual expenses. And so, in conclusion, I'm not saying I'm gonna start a $20,000 backyard farm, but I don't think it would be that hard to do. And, you know, obviously this farm plan is, you know, I suppose I've gone over a lot of stuff. I've gone over kind of like a bit of the crop plan. There's a lot more things that I would grow that I didn't, you know, review specifically. You know, I've gone over like supplies and all that. But yeah, no, I had never spent much time thinking about backyard farms, kind of residential farms, because it's fun for me to think about the larger scale things. But, you know, I am kind of very surprised having gone through this for myself and realizing that if you have growing skills and you have the ability to have the farm be supplemental to your income, obviously I can't live off of a $20,000 farm. But yeah, this is something that I think is very doable for a lot of people. Yeah, interesting. I'm gonna like, I'm thinking. It's making me think. There also is one essential piece that I would need for my flower farm to be as successful as I want it to be, and that is having a website. And if you have a business and you don't have a website yet, what are you doing? Get one. Squarespace can help you. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything from products to content to time. All in one place, all on your terms. I love how easy they make it for me to build a website with their cutting-edge design tools like Blueprint AI and a library of professionally designed templates. But that's not all. Squarespace's invoicing and email campaigns simplifies running your business, leaving you more time for your customers. And it's never been easier to offer services like consultations or experiences with tools like built-in appointment scheduling, or even create member-only content to sell courses and more behind a paywall. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/youcaneatthegrass to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.